Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. We're very excited to have you. So tonight's a very exciting class. As a student in the Schar School's Masters of Public Policy program, I've taken part of Ann Holton's class in the past for this, and I know you're in for a real treat. But speaking of our presenter today, Ann Holton is back as our faculty member after serving as interim president of George Mason from 2019 to 2020. Ann is a professor at the Schar School of Policy and Government and at the College of Education and Human Development here at George Mason. And she's also a visiting fellow at Ed Policy Forward, and she is very much a lifelong advocate for children and families in Virginia. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ann, and she'll go ahead and go over a few bits of information for you.
Thank you, Dylan. And actually, before we dive in, Shannon, did you want to say a quick word of welcome too?
Yes, I did. Thank you so much, Ann, and thank you, Dylan. I'm Shannon Williams. I'm the Director of Student Engagement at the Schar School. And I just wanted to welcome everybody tonight. I've had several conversations with some of you by email and seen you at some events. So I just wanted to say hi. I'm super interested in this topic myself because my background is also in education. So I'm thrilled to be able to be here with all of you. So I'm mostly going to hide behind the scenes, but I'll be in the chat and in the Q&A, and I'll be here to answer questions if you have any. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ann so you all can have just a great class together. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Shannon, Dylan, and Paul, and everybody for joining us tonight. It is such a beautiful day here today, and I hope wherever you are too as well. I'm especially impressed that you've taken your time to spend the next hour with me on this topic that I love so much. I'm gonna dive in just a minute, but I thought I'd do a couple of preliminaries by way of saying, I hope that we can make this as interactive as possible, even in a format that's not totally conducive to that. And therefore, I will tell you ahead of time that I'm going to have a couple of times when I'm going to pause for questions, but I invite you to be thinking about questions and feeling free to submit them throughout. You can do that on the Q&A or in the chat function, and my handy dandy assistant, Dylan Henry, is going to play moderator and help draw your questions to my attention when we get to the pause points or otherwise as needed. And we may also do a couple of little polls in the chat just to liven things up somewhere along the way. So hang with me and we'll jump in and look forward to spending the next hour with you. I'm going to share my screen for at least a little while here, starting with welcome to Politics of American Education. The presentation I'm going to do today is based on some material I use in both my undergrad class, which is by a similar name to this, and also in graduate classes I've taught at Schar and CEHD, combined to Schar and CEHD students on P12 policy challenges. I also teach higher ed policy challenges. Today's topic is primarily about P12, meaning pre-K through 12th grade, through high school. So today's agenda, let me do it this way. Today's agenda. I'm going to spend a little bit of time introducing myself, maybe more than I might ordinarily in this kind of setting, because my personal background and experience is something I use extensively in my teaching, and it's something that's actually one of the fun things about Schar faculty and CEHD, the Ed School faculty in particular, that we've got a lot of faculty who've had a lot of real world experience. And so I will share a few minutes of that, of how I came to care about ed policy, how I came to be engaged in the topic. And then I am going to ask, I love to go around and introduce you, because one of the richness of our course experiences at Mason is to get to include our students' experiences, and in these courses that are interdisciplinary across colleges, education background folks, policy background folks, the diverse perspectives is one of the real benefits. We won't try to introduce you all live today because it would take up all our time, but we will do a little introduction poll. Then I'm going to jump into a little mini lecture on why education policy matters, and then we'll pause for a few minutes of Q&A. And then I'm going to jump into talking about current challenges in P12 education. I'll do a very broad survey of some of the current challenges and then highlight in a little more detail one of what I think is one of the most important challenges in P-12 education today, and that is racial equity, racial injustice issues. Talk a little bit about solutions and political implications, and then I'm going to save a good bit of time for Q&A at the end. So hope you're thinking about what you want to ask or contribute. And then hopefully we'll have just a minute left or two left at the end to talk about studying education policy at Mason and what some of the options are. So without further ado, I will jump in to introducing myself. And many of you may know my bio already. I'm anything but private, having grown up in the political world and living in the political world now in various ways. But you may not know that I like to think that my public service career and my love for public education in particular began at a very young age when I was 12 years old. My dad, Linwood Holton, was elected governor of Virginia in 1969 and started serving in 1970. Hard to believe that that's now 50 plus years ago. To make a very long story short, when he was elected, in his inaugural speech declared that he hoped to make one of his top priorities bringing Virginia into the 20th century, maybe not the 21st, but the 20th century on race relations. And there was a long way to go. And he did a lot of things in his role as governor that helped advance that ball. But the one relevant here is that 7 or 8 months into his term in the fall of 1970, a federal judge ordered the Richmond public schools, where I and my siblings were attending basically lily white schools in the suburbs, ordered those schools, ordered crosstown busing to achieve racial balance in those schools, because all other methods trying to enforce the Brown v. Board education decision from many decades earlier had failed. My dad, my mom, my family, and I made supposedly a family decision. You know how those things go, but we felt included in a decision to do what in retrospect is a very simple thing of complying with the court's order and going to the schools we were assigned to. At the time, while it might seem like not a very big deal at the time, it was a very big deal. My dad being the first of the Southern governors to help try to overcome racial divisions rather than perpetuating massive resistance. On the first day of school, I showed up with my brother. I'm the girl in the goofy, gosh awful culottes, believe it or not, they were cool then. That's my brother standing behind me, and my mother here accompanying me to the middle school, which was then called Mosby Middle School after a Confederate hero, now Martin Luther King Middle School. And this was some other family members greeting us on our first day of school. The school had previously been 100% African-American and pretty much was almost 100% African-American the 2 years that I spent there before I went on to high school, frankly, because most of the other white people who were assigned there, as happened in many of the school divisions that experienced the busing and other court orders to try to achieve racial integration, families left the school system, they moved to the counties, they pulled their kids out of the schools, they started little academies, as they were then called, in people's basements, and did everything but let little white children go to school with little black children, God forbid. I'm going to go back on this slide so you don't have to stare at that goofy picture too much longer. But that, as I say, it was a very meaningful experience for me in a couple of ways. One is it was my first opportunity to be with people whose circumstances and backgrounds were different from mine. And I discovered what you all, I'm sure all know, is that we had, while there were differences and that we could learn from them, but we had a lot more in common, and we all cared more about the math homework and the school play than we did about our racial differences. But I also discovered I got the bug for public service, because my family's role in this, you know, we got some attention for it, and we got my parents helped us see it as an opportunity to be to lead, to help move things forward. And I found it very rewarding, and have been on one sort of public service career ever since. I'll whiz through the rest of my career so I don't stay off. But as I say, starting at age 12, I went to Princeton undergrad, I went to Harvard Law, I came back to Virginia, to my hometown, Richmond, to work for the judge who had issued the busing order that affected my life so much. I worked for him for a year in a traditional one-year clerkship, and then went to work at the Legal Aid Society in Richmond. Thought I would be there forever until when my third child arrived, I decided it was time to be a stay-home mom for a few years. I was then served as a juvenile and domestic relations court judge in the city of Richmond, just a few blocks down the hill from Martin Luther King Middle School. I left that job when my husband was elected governor, Tim Kaine, in 2005, and as Virginia's first lady, as they called me then, I had the opportunity to help pursue foster care reform in Virginia, which is something that I had been engaged in my role at the court. That led me to work in the community college system after Tim was done being governor, with a program that helped get young people coming out of foster care into higher ed through the community colleges. And that led me to when Terry McAuliffe was elected governor in 2014, he asked me to join his cabinet as Secretary of Education, a job for which I was woefully unprepared in many ways, except one, which was in Virginia, the Secretary of Education has very little direct authority. The K-12 school division do not think the secretary can tell them what to do, and she can't. And the college presidents and college boards, likewise, are very independent of the Secretary of Ed. But it is a job that requires convening and bringing people together. And that was something I had done in my foster care reform role as First Lady. And that was in large part why Governor McAuliffe asked me to do the job. And it also, it's essentially a policy advisor job to the governor, and the governor was an enthusiast for public schools and knew that I was and had been all along, not only based on my own experience, but based on my children, my husband and my children's successful experience in public schools. I served as Secretary of Education for 2.5 years, left that job to go on, as I like to say, a tour of the country when my husband was named as Hillary Clinton's running mate in the summer of 2016, and I campaigned across the country for Hillary. My assignment from her was to meet with teachers and educators all across the country, and really did sort of listening tour, which helped broaden my understanding of K-12 education to a national perspective. When that role ended, without further ado, on election day in November of 16, I was at loose ends and didn't know what I was going to do next. Went to see my friend, who was then president of George Mason, Angel Cabrera, to ask his career advice. And he lured me onto George Mason's faculty, where I've been helping promote and establish programs in education policy between the Ed School and the policy school ever since, with a little deviation from that plan for a year to serve as Mason's interim president from the summer of 19 to the summer of 2020, which, yes, did include the first few months of the pandemic. So life is not dull. I've loved every single one of my roles. I'm loving teaching now and delighted to be with you today in that capacity. So that's me. Now I want to learn a little bit about you, and this is just the bare bones, and hopefully if and when you're in any of my courses, we'll have a chance to get to know each other more. But I think I'm going to stop sharing here in just a minute, and Dylan is going to put up a poll and ask you to identify yourself. Are you a current teacher? Are you a prospective teacher? You can check more than one. Are you a current undergrad in public policy, or a current graduate, current or potential undergrad or graduate student, and or something else? And you can describe it in the chat. And I'm going to stop sharing so Dylan can post the poll, and then we'll know a little bit about you.
Absolutely. And so I have posted the poll in the chat. So it should be that strawpoll.me poll. So feel free to click that link and let us know a little bit more about you. And I'll post it one more time for everyone. There we go. And I'll pull up the screen.
Tech trouble for any reason on that, feel free to speak up, but I bet you won't. Everybody start voting.
All right. Go ahead and hit refresh. Awesome. Very cool.
I see some others turning up too. Okay, so we've got a good number of, well, no, I guess we're just starting to get the numbers in.
Yeah, and if you clicked other,
I
please.
know it works.
Yeah, absolutely. If you clicked other, please type what you do in the chat, and we'd love to learn a little bit more about you.
I see somebody, Christine, is a prospective political science major. Great. Some other folks the same. A number of you recently admitted to Mason and starting to learn more about Mason as you're making your decisions about your future. When we get to the Q&A section at the end, feel free to ask, questions. I'm realizing a number of you may be at the deciding what your plans are for next year. So feel free to ask questions on whatever's relevant to your decision making. And if I can't answer them, Dylan or Shannon might be able to, or Paul, or not. If not, we'll figure out how to get you some answers. All right. So we have a number of prospective undergrads. We have a number of prospective graduate students. We have a bunch of others who are signing in. We have maybe just one P12 policy teacher, current P12 teacher. In my current classes at graduate school, I have a lot of students who are currently teaching. God bless them. Many of them spending all day on Zoom with their students and then spending all evening with me and other faculty. And some of them now starting to be back in person.
All right, so it looks like this is just about it for our group over here. So I'm going to turn it right back over to you, Ann.
Great, thanks. I will go back to my screen, my PowerPoint. Well, as I say, one of the things that's fun about our programs at Mason is that we do work really hard to be interdisciplinary, and particularly in this education policy world. And we often do have the benefit of students coming from a lot of different perspectives, both in terms of their past and in terms of their future plans. And we have a lot of fun learning from each other. All right, I'm going to move on to my Why Education Policy Matters part of the conversation. And this slide's full of statistics, and I won't go over them all, but the real point of this slide is one reason education policy matters is education is big. It is big business in the United States and really all around the world. We have 55 million students at any point plus in K-12 education, and this is really just K-12. About 10% of them in private schools, a smaller minority in the homeschool, so most of them in the public school system. It's an interesting population. The English language learner population is up. It's now at a national level, a minority population. 50% or more, at least when these stats were done, were free and reduced lunch eligible, which doesn't mean dire poor, but it means it's a significant low income population, more so than the general population as a whole. Sadly, a fact about the United States that child poverty is so high, just mind-boggling. Annual expenditures of 700 billion plus, and that is again just K-12 education. So by the time you add in early childhood and higher ed, we're talking a very, very significant portion of the economy is in one way or another involved in education. An interesting fact that in the policy world, at least for a long time there, a lot of policy guidance and discussion was coming from the federal government level during the era of No Child Left Behind, especially. So it's sometimes interesting folks to understand that less than 10% of funding in the K-12 world comes from the federal government. Now, higher ed is different, but in K-12, most of the money comes from the states and localities. Typically, education, K-12 education is the biggest item in most states' budgets and in most localities' budgets. It is often a third of every state and local budget. It kind of competes with healthcare, Medicaid for top billing. But what that means is that every policymaker at the local, state, and federal level has an interest in, has a potential engagement in education policy. And that leads to my next point, which is authority over education. K-12 education, again, in particular, is widely dispersed, involves decision makers at all levels of government and in all sectors of government. The executive branch, very active, the legislative branch, active, judicial branch historically has had some major impacts in K-12 education. And that all of that adds up to what I call high public engagement. One of the things, well, one of the ways I like to think of it is everybody's an expert in education. So everybody's been to school. Most everybody knows somebody who's a teacher. Many people have been a teacher. So we find many people are parents of people who have gone to school. So we find when you have legislative discussions, for instance, on education policy matters, everybody in the legislature thinks they know the answer to everything and everything about education. And so we have some very lively and engaged discussions every year in the state and federal legislatures. There are dozens and dozens of bills filed potentially impacting public education. There have also been big changes over the last 50 plus years and lots of activity ongoing in the reform agenda, which we'll talk about a little bit as we go along. And finally, how we do education policy matters a lot for goals that we care a lot about as a nation. The economic competitiveness, if we're not getting our students educated well and not getting them educated for the topics that they're going to be needing to know about for the workforce, then it is a major problem for our country's economic competitiveness, and vice versa. If we've got it right, our economy soars. Social mobility. We like to think of education as being the great equalizer. And one of the things we talk about a lot in the courses that I teach on this subject is how true is that under the current structures, and how much truer could we make it? It matters for democracy. It matters for racial justice, as we'll talk about more as we go. And I think I think I'm going to go ahead and pause here. So if anybody has any questions yet, we can do questions now, or we can save our question time for the end. Dylan, have we got anything?
I mean, I have a question for you. So when it comes to K-12 spending, I know that it comes from both localities, the state, and the federal government, but who spends the most? How would you describe that relationship?
Yeah, so K-12, yes, the feds spend about less than 10%. Now, in this time of COVID, some of these relief packages that have passed Congress this year will change this dynamic for this year. But in normal times, the federal government is the smallest spender. And in theory, in many states, as in Virginia, the states say that it's their intention to fund well over half of education needs. So in Virginia, there's a target where the state says that it's their intention to fund 55% of the cost of public education on average, more in, there's a formula such that the state funds more for lower income communities and less for wealthier communities. So the state's target in Virginia is 55%. Many other states have similar targets. The reality in Virginia is the state underfunds public education, and localities that can, i.e. the wealthier localities, spend more than they are required to. And so the share is really almost exactly the opposite in Virginia. The localities fund about 55% of what's of the non-federal spending compared to the 45% at the state level. Some states, all K-12 spending is at the state level, and these make a difference. You know, the funding, where the money comes from, makes a difference in terms of equity issues, because local funding tends to be very property tax based and therefore wealth based. So the higher the percentage of funding comes from localities, the more inequity you're going to have. Any other questions we should discuss before we move on? I think I see one in the Q&A. What are some ways that policymakers can combat this phenomenon where schools located in wealthier areas receive higher funding? Yeah, great question. And some action has to come, well, there has to be a will. There has to be a desire to change that dynamic. And in a handful of states, there have been significant improvements to statewide funding and to statewide equity of funding. And in my opinion, the reforms that have been most successful have changed funding formulas at the same time as a large increase in funding, because it is very hard politically to take money away from somebody. But so, for instance, California recently went through a major increase in funding for public education. This was several years ago. And as part of that, revamped their formula so as to target needier jurisdictions more. Everybody got more money. All localities did better than they had previously, but the neediest got even more than wealthier. And so some states have had some successful reforms like that. And we can talk more about it when we get farther along in the conversation, but there are some methods that have been successful, but it's not easy. Christian asks, what long-term effects do you think will come from the pandemic on education public policy? Ooh, that's a big one. Lots. The most immediate is that the pandemic has been a time of haves and have-nots. The technological divide, the income impacts, what we know about inequities in education, and graduation gaps have narrowed, but testing gaps have been wide to start with, and have gotten will get wider. I'm absolutely convinced. Technology gaps. So it's not just urban poor, it's rural poor that suffer in any recession, and will continue to. One of the huge challenges in public education right these days is teacher shortages. And I pray every day that our teachers keep coming back. It has been a tough year. What happens between now and next fall may determine just how badly the pandemic hurts the teacher shortage issues. I will say that this latest relief package, and I will say, when I teach my regular class, I spend some time trying to avoid being partisan. And it's not that hard, frankly, because some of the education issues that we confront don't divide along traditional Democratic Republican lines, at least not in the K-12 space. And also try to bring in guests whose partisan background may be different from mine. But let's say I've stopped trying to hide my affiliations, because I couldn't hide them anyway. As a good Democrat, I am very proud that the latest relief package makes major strides in reducing child poverty. Now, it's temporary, so we'll have to see whether they can make those changes last. But if we cut child poverty in half or by a third, which some say the latest pandemic relief package will do, that would have a huge impact on children's lives throughout, and not just school. What happens in the classroom is affected by what happens more broadly. Okay, and I'm going to answer one last question and then move on. How do military academy feeder schools play into the federal public policy event? I'm not sure I can. I'm not sure I have anything particularly to add on that. I'm not sure whether you mean we have a handful of schools that I'm aware of that are K-12 military academies in the public schools. The private military academies I don't know so well. And I don't know how much they've played a role in the federal public policy debate. There are the schools that serve high proportions of military families. There's some funding that comes from the feds for that. Not enough, and there's some policy issues we could discuss on that, but I'm not sure I have a great answer, but would love to hear from you what your experience on it is if we get that chance, either tonight or otherwise. Let me move on to talking, and we've done a little of it already, thanks to you all's great questions, to talking about some current challenges in P12 education. And I'm not going to try to talk about all of these because we would be absolutely here all night. But just a very quick summary of what are some of the key challenges in public ed today. Start with the education reform wars. And there's been really debates going on, well, maybe forever, but certainly since the 1980s, there was a study that came out in 1983, A Nation at Risk, one of a series of studies that have come out over the broader brush of the last century or so, but the one that garnered a lot of attention, declaring that the US education system was woefully inadequate and woefully behind, and that we needed to increase standards and rigor and impose major reforms on public education if we were going to be competitive in the world stage. And we can talk more about that at much greater length when we get to Q&A or when you're in my class sometime down the line. But the long and the short of it is that led to the whole testing movement, the whole standardized testing movement that started in some states, including Virginia, in the early 90s, and then at the national level, late 90s on into the No Child Left Behind era, which led into all, both some intended consequences and some unintended consequences, and all the challenges of teaching to the test, and punitive consequences for schools that were not doing well, some of which were not doing well because of problems within the school, and some of which were not doing well because they were serving some of the neediest kids who brought all kinds of problems from their outside lives into the school with them. The No Child Left Behind law that President Bush enacted in 2000 or early 2000s carried on through President Obama's efforts. Race to the Top was his initiative. And there was a lot of long story short, there was a pendulum swing back from that. And the No Child Left Behind was left behind in 2015 and replaced with the Every Student Succeeds Act, which still has a pretty heavy emphasis on standardized testing, but a little bit more in the encouraging growth, a little bit more in the continuous quality improvement, and a little bit less punitive, and a little bit more deferential to the states, which brings us to the second issue that's been part of the education reform wars, and that's who's in charge. And there have been pendulum swings over time in how much the states have asserted themselves via localities, and then now the federal government asserted itself vis-a-vis the states, and now a pendulum swing back to the states in terms of who has the most influence over what's taught and how schools are held to high standards, and who's holding them to those high standards. So that all comes under education reform wars. Follow the money. K-12 education is chronically underfunded. I don't think you get much argument about that, except there are those who would say that compared in an international comparison, maybe we do spend enough money on K-12 education, except that we expect K-12 education to do all kinds of social safety net work that public schools don't do in many other countries. I don't think you would get an argument that teachers aren't underfunded in the U.S. That I shared charts with my higher ed policy class recently on teachers' wages compared, or education majors' wages compared to other fields, and I hate to say this to this crowd because we so desperately need more teachers, but you should know, if you don't already, that that teachers, elementary, secondary, and early childhood teachers are among the worst paid college grads of any of the fields. And it's for complicated reasons, maybe partly because it's been historically such a female field, but nursing was too. And when that led to nursing shortages, and lo and behold, salaries went up. Hasn't quite happened yet in teaching, but it's starting to. And you all remember that there have been significant teacher strikes or semi-strikes over the last few years. Before the pandemic, there have been big pushes to improve teacher pay, and I think that will continue. Inequitable distribution of funds, we talked about that a little. I've already jumped to low teacher pay. COVID exacerbating all of the above, and the one I want to talk about a little bit more now is racial injustice in education. This is something, I'm going to go turn on an extra light here. I'm just entirely too dark. Racial justice in education is something that impacts K-12 education in so many myriad different ways. And I'm even with that, I'm not, for the sake of focus, I'm not going to try to talk about all of them, but I will talk about a few. Here's a slide I like to use when we talk about race. It's challenging to talk about race, right? It brings up all kinds of feelings and emotions, and folks have different opinions and perspectives. We're so proud that Mason is such a diverse place, but it means that we're having conversations across differences. And I like to remind my students that if you can't talk about difficult stuff in the academy, when can you? So yeah, I like to say, if there's an elephant in the room, introduce him or her. And absolutely, the racial injustice, racial issues are absolutely one of the elephants. And I am going to try and give you a little taste of a very short video clip to help introduce this topic, one of many aspects of racial injustice in the classroom. And this is just 3 little minutes. Hopefully this will work and you can hear it. Give me flags if you can't.
America, they are all older than 7. Every single one of them. And if we're carrying this in us by the time we're 7 years old, then can you just imagine how much more there will be left in there? This is a video clip that we showed some teachers. And when we showed the teachers this video clip, we asked them to look at the video clip and identify challenging behaviors. See how many behavior problems you can find, and can you find evidence that a behavior problem is going to happen really soon? And we had an eye tracker attached to them. And the eye tracker, you can see here in this video, you can see there's somebody, a teacher getting ready to do the eye tracking exam. You'll see a little black bar at the bottom of the screen. That's an eye tracker. It tells us down to the pixel on the screen in a thousandth of a second exactly where the teacher's looking. There's a research assistant. You can see she's looking at the exact same thing. That yellow dot is where that teacher's looking at that specific moment. Now, what we did was we told the teachers, look for challenging behaviors. But what we didn't tell them is the truth. And the truth is this: there's no behavior problems in any of these videos, because they are all child actors that I hired to sit at a table and play with Play-Doh. One of them was a black boy, one of them was a black girl, one was a white boy, white girl. And what I'm really interested in is not how fast can you find behavior problems, because there aren't any to find. What I'm interested in is when I lead you to believe somebody's going to misbehave, who do you look at? Who do you look at first? Who do you look at longest? Who do you keep going back to? In other words, if you were a mall cop, who would you be following at the Gap right now? That's basically what we were doing. And what we found was this. At the end of the study, we showed them the pictures of the 4 children, and we said, which child do you think you had to watch the most? And then the screen went blank, and we asked them, put in the letter of the child that you feel you had to watch the most. Now, we didn't need to ask them who they watched the most. I know down to the thousandth of a second who you watched. What we're curious about it is this: when I lead you to believe that somebody's going to misbehave, where do your biases take your eyes? And then at this point, are you aware of where your biases took your eyes? And then later, after that, are you willing to admit it? And what we basically found was that teachers spend more time looking at the black child when we lead them to believe that someone's going to misbehave, and that's true for white teachers and it's true for black teachers too. But they think they have a boy bias. They think they spend more time looking at boys, especially the black boy. But the reality is they spend more time looking at black children, especially the black boy. You know, so the bias is there, but for teachers, they might be perceiving it as a somewhat different bias, a somewhat more socially acceptable boys will be boys kind of bias. You can see what it looks like here in terms, each one of those dots is where a teacher's looking.
There's a new study of the Yale Child.
So we'll stop there. Let me see if I can get us back to. Yes, good. Part of the point of that is obviously implicit bias, which we've all are learning more about in all kinds of ways. But another part of the point is there is some really good research out there. And one of the things that's exciting about education policy today is the opportunity to try to figure out how to connect research to action. And that kind of research can lead to some real solutions. And Dr. Dillon goes on to talk about programs where a fairly simple intervention of teaching teachers about implicit bias can make a difference. You know what, I'm not going to do a whole lot of this because I'm running a few minutes behind, but racial justice in education is been a topic racial injustice has impacted education going back forever really in the United States. The separate but not equal decision, the separate but equal, but in fact we all know not equal, was a decision with Plessy versus Ferguson was 1896, Brown versus Board of Education was 1954, but not reality, certainly in 1969, 1970 when I was part of the attempts to desegregate the school. More recently, we've seen the ending of some of those court interventions and resegregation. The ongoing impact of race in America is so extensive, and I won't today share with you this 50-year report. The Kerner Commission was a big report on race and the impact of race in America in the late 60s. And just recently, we passed the 50-year mark on the Kerner Commission report, and there was a lot of examination about how far have we come along. And I will tell you, we have made some progress. One gap that has closed considerably is the high school graduation gap between African American and white and other race students. But so many other gaps are just gaping holes. Certainly, all of them that involve money. The wealth gap, the white versus black wealth gap is literally a 10-time factor in the United States. And that's down from where it was at its peak, but it's still humongous and has all kinds of consequences for education at P12 and higher ed. And there's all kinds of history as to how it got there, all of which we can talk about when we have more time. Some of the specific impacts of race in the United States in schools is what we've just looked at is implicit bias, unequal resources based on poverty, unequal discipline connected to those implicit bias issues that we just talked about, and maybe beyond implicit bias. Unequal access to gifted education and advanced courses, underrepresentation of people of color in the teaching profession, a huge problem, especially considering research showing the impact that even one teacher of color can have in a child of color's trajectory in terms of role modeling successful careers. Inequitable impact of teacher shortages. So teacher shortages are a problem everywhere, but most sharply in high poverty and therefore high minority divisions. Poverty has an impact, and concentration of poverty, research shows, has an impact. So if a community and school has more than 40% high poverty, it has consequences above and beyond poverty itself. cultural competency, we've already, cultural competency in the curriculum and for educators, and segregation. I'm not sure actually segregation issues are listed here. So we'll talk about them separately. So very briefly, we're going to have a chance for another poll here. And this one is one where you have to guess. And as I say in my regular classes, I love to do all kinds of interactive. I'm always making my students break up into groups and you be the Board of Education, which by the way, I still serve on the Virginia Board of Education, which is the K-12 oversight board. So I always have fresh experiences. What we were working on last month at our Board of Ed meeting, I'll make you, my students, address. But today we can't do that. But today we can do another little poll. So the question is, what region of the United States do you think has the most segregated schools? And to enable you to try to answer that, I need to get out of my screen sharing.
Yes, I have put in the next straw poll into the chat, so please feel free to click it and then click the answer you think is correct.
And hopefully by the time you've done all that, I will have figured out how to get out of my screen share. So Dylan can share the results. Here we go.
So the question again is, what region do you think has the most segregated schools? Border, so areas around Texas and Arizona, the Midwest region, the Northeast, South, or the West?
And this is currently.
We've got 20 votes so far.
All right, let's refresh one more time and then we'll move on.
All right, sounds good. So it looks like the big winner is the Northeast and the South.
Northeast and the South are tied. Okay, well, what that means is that you all, about half of you fell for my trick questions, my trick question, and half did not. Here's the answer. That, of course, back in 1968, the South were the most segregated schools. The South is the blue line here. I think you can see that starts up at 80%. But the Northeast was then the lowest segregated schools, down here at about 40%. Over time, South came way down and now has started back up. So one of the points of this chart is we are resegregating schools all over from about 1989 forward. And there's some reasons for that and some consequences for that and some potential solutions to that. But meanwhile, the South, while it has come back up, it hasn't come up as much as Northeast. So Northeast has gone from being the best to the worst. So now when we think about solutions, we have to think about solutions that make a difference in all those different settings. I'm not going to talk about these much, except to say that politics is part of the solution to dealing with, for instance, racial issues, racial equity issues in schools. Again, I can't hide my partisan inclinations here when I note that in Virginia, which is the state I know best, and we do a lot of sharing Virginia experiences in my coursework. There's been increasing Democratic leadership in our state legislature, and that has led to a lot of activity on these topics over the last few years. The good news is there have been some bills that have passed that have made a real difference. We're working on revising our history standards. So for instance, the word lynching did not appear in our history standards at all 3 years ago, shockingly. And now that is part of what students are expected to learn about. A bill just passed the state legislature that part of teacher evaluation now, it needs to include cultural competency, and teacher training needs to address it. And yet, even with Democratic leadership, not everything passes. So you all probably saw in the news, there were some major debates in the last General Assembly session about allegations that some of our governor schools, our highest flying gifted schools, are not admitting students of color to the extent they should, and that there's built-in biases. There was a lively debate on that on both sides, and the bill failed, and leaving a lot of hard feelings. Another bill failed with almost no support, but I think worth mentioning, the Board of Ed, again, on which I sit, has the authority under the Virginia Constitution to draw school division lines. So for instance, we could get rid of much of the segregation that now happens across school districts, but for the fact that the General Assembly has constrained our ability to do so. And somebody boldly proposed legislation that would allow us to do that, and commanded that we take equity into consideration in drawing school division lines. And let's just say that bill went down with a thud. The politics of it just are not there yet, even in a Democratic controlled legislature. So with that, we're back to Q&A time, and let's do a few minutes of this, and we'll save 1 or 2 minutes at the end just on some how to study ed policy at Mason.
Yeah, and we have a question right off the bat. And so they ask, how does education affect private schools, if at all?
So education policy absolutely affects private schools in lots of ways. Many of the standards that the Board of Education sets for the state do apply to private schools as well as publics. So for instance, we've recently adopted new policies about the use of restraints and seclusion that apply to all schools, public and private. The public entities have some say over the accreditation of private schools. There are some sources of funding for private schools that comes from public coffers, various education voucher programs and or education tax credits at the state level. You all may have seen Secretary DeVos was unsuccessfully pushed a voucher program at the national level that might have led to more funding for private schools. Even things that happen to the public schools only affect private schools. For instance, some of the pushback to the testing mania over the last 20 years, and you hear my opinion showing through here. I think it pushed some families to opt out of the public system and into the private system. I think that's going to be one of the interesting consequences of the COVID pandemic, that private schools were much readier to and more able to, for various reasons, open more quickly during the pandemic. And many families, the public school enrollment declined, and some of that was holding back kindergartners to let them start a year later, but some of that was families switching to the private sector. What's that going to do to the public sector funding in the long run? So lots of implications.
Great. And another question for you is, to what extent do you think gerrymandering affects the quality of education for low-income communities today?
Great question. And one we could talk about all night. I'll just say, I think gerrymandering affects everything it affects the quality of governance at the state and federal level. With gerrymandering, we really push legislators' perspectives to the extremes. And I'm very excited that Virginia has embarked on a process of coming to nonpartisan redistricting as a result of the 2020 census. It'll be some time before it makes its way in. I'm going to jump through, I'm looking at these questions, and I'm just going to jump through them real quickly and try to answer them in great detail. But general view on standardized testing, I think the pendulum swung too far, and I think it's a good thing that we're swinging it back. I do think that there is a role to be had, and I'm not anti-testing, but to do testing well is expensive and hard, and trying to help school divisions figure out how to do it well, and how to have state regulations regarding saying do well is tricky. Biggest opportunities for improving the education for the needs of LGBT students, particularly transgender. Well, that's something that Virginia has been in the thick of because some of the court cases. Obviously, the simplest thing is just acceptance. And I think that as a nation, we are moving in that direction. Acceptance of difference, of the value that difference brings to everybody. but there are lots of communities that aren't there yet. And we have to think about how to help folks get there. Can education policy learned at Mason be applicable and applied internationally? Well, we do have some international, we have some really great faculty at Mason who study and teach in international education policy. So the answer is absolutely yes. And then if I have a chance to do both of these last two real quickly, somebody grew up in a highly white area of the Midwest. Rarely students of color present, let alone teachers. How do you think teachers can go about teaching and speaking frankly about race to an all or mostly white classroom? Great question. I love talking about race issues in my classes more in the undergrad context because Mason is so diverse than in the grad context, because sadly our graduate programs are not as diverse as our undergrads. And so we're sometimes having discussions about race with an all or almost all white crowd. And I think the answer is to do it very carefully. The ed school faculty this year we're all reading How to Be an Anti-Racist together. It's our all faculty reads book. And, I think it's a topic that we all have to think really hard about. And the experiences of last year have woken us all up, even if we weren't already. What work has the Virginia government or the federal government done to combat redlining? I won't try to answer that today other than to say it is crucially important. Redlining meaning housing discrimination. And the truth is, over the course of the last century, what the feds have done, federal and state policy has been encouraging redlining and neighborhood segregation, which therefore led to school segregation. Some of those bad policies have ended, but affirmatively, the answer is not enough has been done, but there are things that school divisions and housing policy folks can do. And finally, what do you think about the school to prison pipeline? And if it's a legitimate creak of our public school system? Absolutely it is. When I was a juvenile court judge, I absolutely saw juveniles arrested for driving while Black. I mean, I had a cop tell me one time, well, why'd you pull those kids over? Well, 4 Black boys in a Honda, honest to God. Anyway, a topic we can talk about at great length, but the data, the anecdote and the data show that there is a school to prison pipeline, and it has major consequences that we as a society need to address. Well, great questions. How wonderful to talk with all of you. I really want to honor your time, so I'm just going to race through really quickly that we do have some great education policy programs at Mason. As undergrads, we have lots of public policy courses that touch on education in various ways, but one specifically, Politics of American Education, which I will be teaching in the fall at PO 303, and that we teach, somebody teaches it at least every year, and sometimes both fall and spring semesters, that delves into all of the topics we talked about today in greater length. And I really hope that we get prospective teachers and prospective policymakers into that class so we can have robust discussions together. At the graduate level, SHAR's Masters in Public Policy program has an emphasis area on education policy, and that program tracks along with, at the College of Education and Human Development, an Ed Policy certificate. For both of those programs, we have 5 core courses, which are listed there, but there are also a number of other courses that can be substituted in for those, but that gives you a general idea. And both of these programs are fairly new. I helped start them when I came to Mason in 2018 on the faculty, but are thriving, and we've had some really interesting and lively cross-disciplinary work in those areas. The last slide, and I will ask Dylan and Shannon and Paul if they can send all of these slides out to you, so you'll have the slide deck for your reviewing pleasure, and that has contact information about the SHAR programs in public policy, including the emphasis area, I think, is on there. The certificate program is there. I think I checked to make sure all of those links were current, but if not, let me know. And then my contact information and Dylan's contact information and the SHAR general mailbox. So do feel free to reach out if you've got questions or feedback, and I look forward to and hope I get to meet many of you somewhere along the way. I'm not going to rush away. I've got a couple more minutes if anybody wants to hang around with a question, but I don't, as I say, I really try to honor your time. And so I don't, we will stop the general presentation here. And I will get out of my screen share. Dylan, anything else?
No, thank you all so much for all the wonderful questions. It was a real treat to read all of them. And thank you all so much for joining us this evening. I sincerely hope you've enjoyed the presentation as much as I've enjoyed the presentation as well. And keep in mind, we love talking with students at any point they are in their process with George Mason, the Schar School of Policy and Government. And so if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to either myself at dhenry4@gmu.edu or the Schar School at schar@gmu.edu, or you can reach out to Anne herself at aholton2@gmu.edu. And we're always happy to chat, to talk about ed policy and talk about the admissions process and what it's like to be a Mason student here. But with that, thank you all so much for your time. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening and have a great day.
Enjoy the beautiful weather. Bye all.